David Bernard podcast. You are listening to episode 2. That's right. This is only my second podcast that I've ever hosted. I'm having a lot of fun, and hopefully you guys will be along for the rest of them as we move throughout the year. We're going to try to produce these podcasts about every 7 to 10 days. On top of it, if we've got a major weather event pending, not just tropical season, could be severe weather or some of this horrific winter weather we've seen over the last few weeks, we're going to bring in all the Fox 8 meteorologists and do a Weather Authority roundtable ahead of the event to help to keep you up to date. A reminder, not only do we have the audio version of the podcast, there's a video version if you'd care to watch, and that's available at fox8live.com, and there's also going to be a link on YouTube as well if you just search for the David Bernard podcast. And of course, you're listening to the podcast right now, you know where to find it, and we're available on just about every podcast app that you can think of. Well, today we are going to talk about weather-related phobias and traumas. Are you afraid of the weather? Maybe storms render you unable to think properly or function. Maybe you've suffered a traumatic event as a result of the weather, like a flood, loss of property. Maybe a hurricane does it. We know we've had those around here. Does even the thought of a tropical wave moving off Africa trigger your anxiety? I know that it can happen to a lot of people. Well, to help to understand these fears and how traumatic experiences can impact our daily lives, we have Dr. Charles Figley of the Tulane University as our guest. Dr. Figley is one of the country's leading experts on trauma. He came to Tulane in 2008 from Florida University, where he founded the Traumatology Institute, now known as the Tulane Traumatology Institute. Welcome to the podcast, Dr. Figley.
Thank you very much, David. Glad to be here.
I think this is going to be an interesting topic. You know, about being a broadcast meteorologist for 30 years, I've seen a lot of weather, I've seen a lot of catastrophic events, and of course your specialty being trauma, that comes into play a lot with what I've done.
Yes, absolutely. I'm sure it would.
Yeah, and one thing that I noticed is, as I was talking about in your introduction, and the Traumatology Institute, one of the impetuses for that was the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995. I happened to be in Tulsa, Oklahoma for that event. I remember the morning that it happened, and we got a call from one of our tornado chasers who lives there, and basically said that he had been shaken out of his bed. He did not know what had occurred, but he thought that it might be something dramatic, and of course, we jumped all over that. How were you brought to that disaster, so to speak?
We're talking about Oklahoma?
Yes.
Yes. I started an organization, actually, as a result of Oklahoma City. I was invited by a state's representatives, I think, not a senator. And Laura asked me to come in and to basically do an assessment of how things are standing right now. It happened probably about 2 months earlier than that. So we spent a lot of time assessing it, 2 days or so. I brought another professor with me. And we decided what they wanted, and probably what they also needed, was to be educated about how to treat trauma, how to assess it, how to evaluate, how to work with clients either with or without trauma, and also to deal with their own trauma. So it worked out pretty well. We provided later on, maybe a month later, we brought in a number of people, and we had probably about 1,000 overall over the several courses of Oklahomans who participated. So it seemed to work very well. And then early the next year, we had another training to enable them to provide supervision because it was specifically for mental health professionals. So they were able to increase the number of trained people through their efforts then next year.
And of course, we'll talk more about your Traumatology Institute that's now at Tulane University. And also, of course, we are going to discuss Hurricane Katrina a little bit later on. That had a huge impact on this region and still does to this day, and probably will for a long time, like most traumatic events. Now, I did also build this in my introduction as a podcast, not just talking about trauma, but I thought we'd start maybe a little bit lighter, although I don't think phobias are something you want to take light of, but sometimes they can not be, I guess, as crippling as, say, a major traumatic event. I may be wrong on that, underselling it, but phobia is kind of a word that a lot of us lay people kind of toss around. What exactly is a true phobia that is diagnosed?
Essentially, it is really a fear of the unknown. They're afraid of something specific, but they don't recall when they became afraid of it, most often. But even if they do, it's not really a particular event typically. So for the most part, it's more of a adaptation to what all of us have. All of us have, it's like a card game, you're shuffled certain things and dealt certain things. And so phobia is something that a lot of people live with in various levels of pathology or difficulty.
So why do people have them? Are more people predisposed to them than others? Why do we think these occur?
There have been lots and lots of research on all kinds of anxiety disorders, including but not limited to phobia. And we really don't know. I mean, in effect, we don't. There have been lots of hypotheses that have been investigated, but we know that there's a genetic and environmental interaction in that some people are more predisposed to phobia than other people. And there are certain things that happen in childhood that may be a little upsetting in that kind of context, but they carried that with them, not necessarily remembering that particular event. That's fairly unusual, but having the symptoms of phobia. And it varies. Some people have phobia, height phobia, and after a certain period of time, they get over it. But one of my neighbors, I don't know, 20 years ago or so, was a firefighter, and he began to develop symptoms of a phobia, height phobia. So it's very common going in and out of these types of phobias, but it's highly treated. And I taught a course on how to treat it using a particular treatment method.
And of course, we're going to get into some weather aspects of it in a second, but are phobias, are they rational or are they irrational, or is there some legitimate biological defense mechanism built into them that's maybe taken to the extreme?
That's a good question. It's basically an irrational fear. The person who is experiencing it does not have a rational explanation for it, and they're hoping that you do. But it's just something that happens to all of us at various levels of difficulty, really. So it's something we all live with. And my guess is that if you do a survey of your colleagues there in the station, that you'll find a number of people, if not all people, many people have phobias.
Okay, well, let's talk about some of mine. I think I had mentioned to you earlier, I am afraid of lightning and I am afraid of heights, but I'm only afraid of heights if it's unrestricted. If I'm in a plane, I'm okay. If I'm in an office building with glass, I'm fine. It's if I'm out on a balcony, that makes me nervous. And I tend to just avoid that situation. I don't like, it's not a crippling type of fear for me because I know what it is and I do something about it. Same with lightning. I get very nervous, even as a meteorologist, outside, and if I even remotely see lightning or hear thunder, I want to run inside, which is what you're supposed to do. But I get a little bit, I guess, elevated. You could say heartbeat, maybe just a bit when that's going on. Do I have a true phobia? I mean, how do you?
Yeah, you had a true
this?
phobia. but it's not a problem. I mean, if it's a problem, you would do something about it, and you are able to avoid it. You know the cause, the consequence. You know the feeling in your body. You know how and why it elevates, and why and how it goes down. So I think that you're fine if you want to have that as an assessment, because lots and lots of people. I mean, I was in a Marine unit in which we were jumping off out of planes and off of boats and all that sort of thing. And there were a number of people that were afraid, that had specific phobias that they talked about, and they forced themselves to do it. Did they feel better about it? No. Did they get over it? Not really. So it's just something that is part of the tapestry of human beings.
And so another example will be, bad weather. We can't stop it, right? Bad weather is going to happen. We're going to have lightning. We're going to have tornadoes. We have hurricanes. But let's take, for instance, I have a colleague at work, and this person is not a meteorologist, and so may not be armed with the same amount of information that I do. Since I understand what's happening, it helps control my fear. But as soon as the first tropical wave comes off Africa, and it usually takes 14 days for it to come across, and most of them don't do anything, this person is triggered, has almost a physical response to that, probably because of prior experience with hurricanes. Katrina might be one of them. How do you deal with your fears, so in that case, so it doesn't just consume you? What are some coping mechanisms?
If you haven't sought treatment, it will be a challenge, because you're doing the opposite of what your body is telling you to do. But a good therapy would be very, very helpful in that regard. Anything that is described as you do, in which it's the person is in many ways out of control. They need assistance, but in some cases they reserve or they avoid it. So the best thing to do is to get help in that regard. Take deep breaths, shut your eyes, lower the stimulus, etc. But that's only in the short term. But you need really the attention of a professional, and it's not going to take that long. It's a very standard problem that can be overcome relatively easily. As I said before, I taught a continuing education course on how to eliminate it, and we had people standing on tables and various other things that they were afraid of initially, but they were able to do it.
All right, so those are phobias, and those seem to be ones that if you get treatment, you can I guess manage it. I guess anything, if you have proper treatment and learn how to deal with it, can be managed. But let's shift a little bit from phobia to, at least in my mind, trauma, which has really been your life study, and the origins of your interest in trauma go all the way back to the Vietnam War. Am I correct?
Yes.
And so,
yep.
Those were some.
I've been around a long. I've been around a long time. Yeah, the simple explanation is that trauma is remembering a real event that took place. They may not be able to remember all the details of it, but it absolutely did take place, and that those fears then are palpable. It can happen again when we are. If you think you've had trauma or whatever, we typically, when we're in a very difficult situation, we ask some questions. What happened? Why did this happen? Why did I act the way I did at the time? Crazy. Why have I acted the way I have since that time? In which you fear different things now. And what if this happens again? Will I be able to cope? These are real, appropriate questions, and that obviously, again, the person should seek treatment if they're out of control, if it is difficult in their own personal life, if you're making it hard for other people around you. Yes, you need to do something about it. But for the most part, it's there until you do something about it. And I would say from my research on combat veterans that in many ways it softens and frequently it goes away. And it's most often associated with being able to go over the events that cause the trauma, if and more often than not, there's a general sense of that. and be able to deal with any of the symptoms. But the main point here is that it's hidden inside of us and in our memories, and we then need to seek professional help in order to be able to extricate those and address them.
And that's why a lot of times you hear people that have maybe had abuse and things like that. It's important
Yes.
to talk about it and pull it out of them. And so there's,
Yes.
I guess, a more conscious awareness of what that trauma was. Because if you can't actually communicate it, there's not a way to work through it.
That's right. But as you say, more often than not, you're able to get them to talk about it. As practitioners, we set up the office in a way that's comfortable. It's not off-putting and upsetting, etc. Very nice, smooth, comfortable environment. But even with those that are not practitioners, this is very, very common. So for those of you who feel that you have a friend that's suffering, etc., try to talk to them. Sit down and calmly and rationally enable them to feel comfortable enough to tell you what's going on. You may not be able to solve the problem, but you certainly will be very, very helpful knowing some of what they're talking about to get them assistance.
I guess we'll talk a few minutes now about Katrina, and I was going to give a little bit of my story here, which is it's difficult for me to talk about, actually. And I actually was not here the day the storm hit. In 2005, I accepted a job with CBS in Miami, and I left New Orleans 6 weeks before Katrina. And my last day of work here in New Orleans as a broadcast meteorologist at the time, we had Hurricane Dennis. As you may remember, 2005 was just one storm after another, not too unlike what we just experienced this past year with 5 Louisiana landfalls. And so we already knew it was going to be an active season. Well, I get to Miami, I get settled, Hurricane Katrina happens, and you know, the first thing that happened was when I saw the shift in that track and the intensity of the storm, it really created a response in me that was, I would say, almost a level of anxiety that was difficult to deal with. But my professional brain took over, and I spent the entire night calling people in the middle of the night in New Orleans saying, this is the one. I might say to friends in the past, no, you're okay here, you're okay. But this one, I thought everybody has got to take action. And the station in Miami, of course, immediately sent me to New Orleans to cover the aftermath of the storm. And I won't get into all the details, but just getting there was a harrowing experience. But when I got there, Doctor, I've never seen anything so horrible in my life. I specifically remember we were on those airboats going down Airline Highway at one point, right by where I used to live in Old Metairie at one point, and we were helping, we were CBS Radio, we were helping to ferry people off of the overpass there at Interstate 10 back to the causeway where they put on buses, and we got up to the ramp, and these 2 young girls approached me, and one of them was holding a baby, and she was trembling. She was physically shaking, and they had a bag, and I talked to her friend, and I said, what happened? And she said she had the baby 48 hours ago, right before landfall at University Hospital. The hospital started taking on water, and they just gave her all this medicine and said, you're on your own. And they've been sitting out there with this newborn. I can't ever get the image out of my head. And I will admit, I did see some people that had drowned, that had not been recovered. I was at the convention center. I saw people with bloody feet who had walked miles to get there. And, that was my experience. My house behind Tulane University, where I'm sure you're familiar with, on Palmer Avenue in Willow is where I lived, had 3 or 4 feet of water. I had just sold that house. It was a lot. And, that first year I was in Miami, I didn't even lose anything, right? I got out of there. I guess I had survivor's guilt was what I was going through.
Yes. True.
And, so that doesn't, we're going to talk about everyone else's experience and yours in a minute, but that was a lot for me to process. And it really took about 6 months for me to realize I think I'm depressed. And, had to talk to somebody about what had gone on. All my friends lost everything, and I'm sitting here pretty in Miami with my new job.
Yes. Yeah, that's a very, very common thing. It happens in all disasters. Actually, in all kind of mishaps, frequently, the sense of surreal as you went through the city, that you don't really recognize some areas that you had earlier, and the devastation, but also the human misery that you had to witness, and you couldn't do anything about it, really. That is among the hardest things that those of us who work in recovery feel worst about, is that not everyone made it. Not everyone made it as well as they could. There's always going to be something, and all of us who work in recovery shake our heads because we're talking to each other about things and saying to the other, "Let it go, let it go." But it's very difficult. Obviously, with social work and psychology, we're mostly interested in saving lives and enabling people to get on their feet so they'll feel independent. But in a tremendous, horrific disaster like Katrina, it's kind of hard to get on your feet. And you said 6 months later, that's when you finally were able to kind of focus on what exactly happened to you. Imagine all of the combat veterans that come back from war and how they're feeling. It's exactly that way. Imagine all the firefighters and those who are first responders through this pandemic, and how those experiences grow and grow and emerge into various kinds of forms, frankly, that we need to do something about.
Let me ask you about Green Cross and
Yeah.
their relief efforts during Katrina that you were involved in.
Yeah, Green Cross is a nonprofit mental health crisis intervention organization. They started, we started it back in 1995 in response to the Oklahoma City bombing. And so what typically happens is you have an event, you go in to provide emergency mental health and assistance, but you attach yourself to a organization locally that has invited you, because that's really critical. So we work with them to enable them to come up to speed, but also then do a lot of training is mostly the case. We provide direct services, but more often than not it's direct training. So with Katrina, we went in, the Green Cross went in there. In contrast to New York and other places, we went in for a specific organization, and that was the Humane Society of the United States. Their responsibility was to take care of the animals. And as you know, there are a lot of people that left their animals assuming they would be coming back relatively quickly. So it was let's say it was an emotional, rather challenging experience.
And so when we look at something like Katrina, the impacts, and of course, I'm probably going to do something with you separately on the pandemic because my goodness, I mean, there's going to be so many layers to that. I don't even know where to begin. But let's talk about the lasting impacts of just Katrina alone. I believe you have a large research project that you've been involved with. It's called Katrina at 10. And what does that show, and any lessons from that?
Yeah, the real challenge is that the last meeting, we were dividing up data on who would publish what. So we're not at the beginning of the study because we've collected all the data. We're now at a point of sorting it out and then telling the story. And I am not exactly sure how we're going to tell the story, but I know that there are a lot of heroes in our story in New Orleans, people that have stepped up, who sacrificed a lot, and not necessarily professionals in their organizations, but people, regular people. But I think the main thing with regard to, first of all, It is an NICHD grant, and the primary author, the leader really, is Mark Van Lanningham from the School of Public Health and Tropical Medicine. And it's a 5-year program, and we have, the nice thing about this is that it's not just us. We're bringing in the leaders in the area of research and who've had especially experience in New Orleans. So it has been a tremendous learning experience for all of us in working together. This is the largest research project and the most ambitious with regard to 5 years. So it's already, we think, we've already helped the community in terms of letting them know as soon as we know what are the realities there, so they're not surprised. But it's a long project, and it will continue for another couple of years.
And just, what are, just briefly, some of the aspects of trauma and I guess social ills that can come out of something like Katrina? Have we seen the full impacts of, or understand the full impacts of what that disaster did to our region?
I think we have access to it, but we haven't really comprehended it effectively. I think that we're just scratching the surface in our work. This really looks at the immediate and long-term recovery, psychosocial recovery. But if we look at how industries are doing, how particular the law enforcement, there are so many sectors within New Orleans that are critically important to all of us that we really don't know that much about. For example, in terms of emergency services, these folks are highly at risk in their profession. But it was especially the case that we found in our research that we hadn't really been able to attend to them. So hopefully we have spurned, and we certainly have spurned, a number of dissertations that will be able to study the full impact of this work.
I mean, one story that's just now coming to mind is about 2 or 3 years ago. I had, through a connection at the station, a gentleman's son who wants to be a meteorologist. And this young boy was, I think he was around 8 to 10, might have been 10 at the time that he visited the station. And I said to his father, I said, "Oh, where do you think this interest came from?" And he said, "Well," he goes, "to begin, when he was, I guess he was about 3 or 4, they lived in New Orleans East. Hurricane Katrina happened, of course, devastating flooding in the east. They lost their entire home. Then, as you may recall, we had the large tornado in New Orleans East, 3 or 4 years ago. So this was right after that. Their home got destroyed. And so, I asked the young boy, I said, how are you coping with all of this?" And he goes, "Oh, I'm doing fine, but I have to do meteorology. I mean, maybe that's like a good thing that came out of it. He was able to channel this into wanting to understand and learn more about it. But I thought, my goodness, I mean, this family has had 2 horrific disasters in the course of a decade."
Yes. And I think you're right. I think that it was his way of being able to cope with this ultimately. He knew he needed to go to college and various other things, but that was the escape for him because he wasn't able to put anything back in the bottle, the genie in the bottle, because of this, the terrible storm. But yes, that there have been all kinds of positive things, and I see this in my classes all the time, in which people talk about specific storms that they survive, which increase their interest in becoming a social worker. So,
and finally, the last I want to talk to you about is post-traumatic stress disorder,
yes,
PTSD. Now, again, like the word phobia, lay folk like me will be like, "Oh, that gave me PTSD." It's kind of become this term that's thrown around lightly, but of course, as we know, it's not a term to be thrown around lightly. Now, is this a more intense form of trauma, or is that specifically related, as it says, to a condition that occurs after a traumatic event that maybe not everybody has?
Yes, it's relatively unusual, frankly, because and thus you question why it's used so frequently because it's so unusual. Um, yeah, it is essentially it's being frightened and then constructing an explanation for why we're uh, afraid, in effect. So with post-traumatic stress disorder, it's a clearly a disorder in contrast to a reaction. So it's a psychiatric, psychological disorder caused by a specific event or series of events. It could be only one event, and some have had traumatic event, post-traumatic stress disorder specific to only one. But for most people, it's over time, and it's an accumulation, and it changes in effect.
It,
But
it,
it is. Go ahead.
oh no, I mean, is there anything? What are some of the negative impacts of that as far as people's daily lives? Because clearly, I'm sure there are people as a result of Katrina or other major weather-related disasters that might have that condition.
Yeah, so you wanting to know what characterizes it? Yes. Uh, Sleeping problems typically are the issue. Startle responses, um, having fear associated with a particular event, obviously. It's the notion of feeling changed, unsettled, and you think that there's something wrong with your mind, that you are going crazy, in effect, because it changes you from being a fearful of certain things, but being absolutely terrified after that. So it's certainly a variation from it. It's a spectrum, right, where you have it. You can be hospitalized as a result of that and lack of effectiveness. But on the other hand, there are some people who have been diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder maybe years ago, and over time they have recovered. They feel far better than they did. I happen to have more access or have studied combat veterans and I typically think through and reference their own struggles and difficulties based on military service and then discharge, et cetera, et cetera. But everyone really follows pretty much the same kind of pattern. But there are some that recover spontaneously. There are other people that are medicated and never get off the medication. I have seen it, though, change over the years. I was, I think, one of the first to study post-traumatic stress disorder, even before it was identified as a disorder, which was in 1980. And the diagnosis has been modified by the American Psychiatric Association, saying, let's change this so this is better, or we have less damage here.
Yeah.
So it has evolved over the years.
All right, very good. Well, Dr. Figley, this has been a fascinating conversation. It's a serious topic, a major mental health issue in our country for various reasons, not just from weather-related disasters, and I think you've helped to give us a better understanding of that. Dr. Charles Figley from the Tulane Traumatology Institute, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much, David. Appreciate it.
And a reminder for the podcast, if you'd like to watch it, it's available at fox8live.com. And of course, we have it on YouTube as well. If you just search for the David Bernard Podcast, and of course, the audio version available from your favorite podcast app. We're on just about all of them. Remember, you can always watch Fox 8 News on our website, fox8live.com. We stream live there as well as on our news and weather apps. And I encourage you to download those. Well, speaking of weather phobias and traumas, we are now entering the spring severe weather season. Coming up on the next episode, we are going to be discussing severe weather awareness in southeast Louisiana and the Gulf Coast, the threats that we've seen in the past, what we can expect this spring, and what we should all be doing about it. So I hope you will join me then. Until then, I'm David Bernard. Stay safe.